Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first Electronics Lifecycle and Supply Chain Summit. This is our second session. The first one went off brilliantly. Our second guest today, our keynote speaker, David Paulson with Avnet Velocity. Well, interesting experience with David. I was trying to catch hold of him at Electronica in Munich, and to be honest, it was an accelerated run for him. He was running from one customer to the other. I could only see a glimpse of him and a quick wave of the hand. He told me we will catch up later, and I'm glad we finally caught up with David where he cannot run anymore. My name is Bolaji Ojo, publisher and managing editor of the Ojo Ishida Report. Thank you for joining us. If you have a question for David, please hit the Q&A button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and type in your question. We'll try and get to as many of these questions as possible on a live session. If we can't, we will definitely answer them in the live chat. David is going to be talking about supply chains evolving role in accelerating technology innovations. And David, like I said, is the Global Vice President, Head of Avnet Velocity. He's a veteran with Avnet. I'm going to let him you all in on a good secret. Today, this month rather, is the 30th anniversary of David's employment at Avnet. David, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Balaji, and thanks for that. I appreciate the anniversary shout out. As we just talked about, it's been a great run with Avnet, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk through how we're seeing supply chain really being used to accelerate the market. Okay, so as Balaji introduced the session, it is really about how supply chain is being utilized to accelerate innovation, right? The supply chain is really moving more and more to being used as a vehicle to capture value and really driving to meet and exceed performance goals and customer experience, market penetration, and ultimately revenue goals. So today, I'm going to do a very brief intro to Avnet, talk a little bit about our positioning, but I really want to get into getting level set on the market dynamics and what we're seeing in terms of the complexity, and then bleed that into how we're seeing some of our partners engage that complexity and really using supply chain as a service to meet and attain the goals and the challenges that are being put forward. And then lastly, we'll close with Q&A. I'm very excited to kind of hear what you guys are thinking after I get a chance to talk through, how we're seeing the market evolve. And that's my favorite part, is to hear what's going on out in the world. So with that, let's jump in. So first, just a little bit about Avnet. When you think about Avnet, you think about a company that's positioned everywhere electronic components are either designed through electrical engineers and software engineers, or the correlating supply chain that fulfills it. So you see, I won't go through all of it, but you see, the global footprint we have. We have 2,000 engineers on staff, 3.2 million engineers in our community where we're facilitating these designs. When you see Avnet, the name itself feels techie in the net portion of it, but actually Avnet's a family name. We've been in existence for 103 years. And Charles Avnet started us in New York City on Radio Row. We're now headquartered in Phoenix, Arizona. We've been publicly traded since 1960, ultimately moved to the NASDAQ in 2018, and are 157 on the Fortune 500. We've got roughly 15,000 employees, and we run a July to June fiscal year, which recently closed at just a pinch under $24 billion. So just a quick update on that, and just even a quick summary on, how we go to market. And I really focused on, much like today's session is really focused on, the customer element of that. And, when we look at our customer segmentation, and the amount of customers we serve, which, in this model is well over 1 million customers on a global basis. Every customer has a little bit different needs. So we segment those customers really into 3 high-level categories. So first off, at the top of the pyramid, and quite frankly, where I spend most of my time with global strategic accounts, we've got a specialized group under Avnet Velocity that really focuses on the needs of this customer and innovating around their problem statements, specifically tailored programs that meet the specific needs of that top of the pyramid customer. In the middle section, in our core distribution model, that's really about building in efficiencies for our suppliers and our customers. So bringing the 1 million customers we have in our customer base and bringing them to the 3,000 suppliers we have on the other side, and vice versa, allowing a customer to access 3,000 suppliers in an efficient manner through a single point of contact, really built around the efficiencies of that supply chain. And then with that comes the engineering resources that I talked about before, where we're deploying engineers to help facilitate the ideation and close of design, and then following that through all the way to production. The last customer segment is really our high service business model, which is fulfilled through our Farnell and network group. It's really about high, web-based speed and convenience, and really meeting the needs of the overall customer base, whether they're a global strategic or in the core, in a manner that allows them to buy one of something and then take that experience and bring that supply chain continuum all the way into production. So one of something could be a development kit. It could be samples. It could be our single reel as you're moving from NPI into prototype into NPI and ultimately into production. And what we're really trying to drive from a supply chain perspective is this continuum of services that runs that full gamut of supply chain. All of that's underpinned by our global infrastructure, both physical and digital, really driving the seamless and dependable and efficient, ultimately global and cost-effective models. So that's, as I mentioned, I wanted to keep that very, very brief, but that's a brief introduction into Avnet. So as we move now, into the supply chain and really focusing in on optimization and what's going on in the market, I really want to take a minute just to level set, because over the past few years in particular, there's really been a new norm set. And that new norm really has resulted in the acknowledgement and execution of supply chain programs based on the criticality that's been acknowledged by the executives in our companies. So, with that, when I look at what's going on in the market, it really all starts with, on the customer side, business continuity planning. The C-suite of the OEMs and our contract manufacturing customers are looking at what occurred in the last period of constraints and resetting business continuity planning and having the high tech and semiconductor portion of that be a higher priority. The examples are easily pointed toward what occurred in the automotive segment during the constraints, and ultimately, driving programs that no longer allow, or at least mitigate, the idea of a $1.50 microcontroller for a windshield wiper motor, not allowing a pickup truck to be built. And so with those business continuity plans are driving the minimization of risk, avoiding that line down, and ultimately, as I said at the outset, hitting revenue and time to market targets. Ultimately having the inventory there and the payment terms and the flexibility all associated with that to make it still a profitable endeavor. And that is a fine line between, assurance of supply and then ultimately what that means to overall cost. What is interesting about where we stand is there are similar challenges and similar goals on our supplier side, where during that constraint period, it became very clear that they needed more visibility. They needed, a single version of the truth in order to plan to build semiconductors. When you look at a semiconductor manufacturing time, it's a 13-week period once it gets into the fab. But the planning actually is more like a 26-week horizon that a semiconductor company needs to attain the raw materials, attain the space at their fab, or whether that's internal or external. And what happened during this constraint period is all of these resources on the supplier side, who are really targeted to help the customers close their designs and get their product to market, ended up spending a lot of time expediting parts and chasing manufacturing, which is really not their intent, and frankly an inefficient use of those resources. So on one side we have our OEM customers, our EMS customers, really wanting more out of the supply chain in terms of business continuity planning, and then on the other side, our suppliers needing more out of the supply chain in order to service that. And those categories really fall into really five major ones. It's really the visibility is the highest priority. How can I see what's going on in my supply chain? Having the control and agility to move that product around, the responsiveness to change direction in the event of a disruption or a priority change. And ultimately, the basis of that falls under assurance of supply, but then being able to globally orchestrate it. And although this is definitely a marketing slide, but know that these five priorities are independent of Avnet. These are the things we bring to market. These are the things we're bridging in terms of the gap. But the gap itself, the gap itself is there and it's real. And so this is a supply and demand gap analysis. But what is also now occurring in the model and is exacerbated by the current market conditions is the complexity of the high-tech ecosystem continues to get more complex over time. So as I mentioned before, you have this flow of design, raw materials leading to fab, final test and assembly, and ultimately those products needing to get into a global market, which now includes, OEMs and EMS and all of the complexities associated with, the assuring the labor and the regionalization and the geopolitical portions of this have all made a complex supply and demand environment even that much more vital to have a crisp and thought out supply chain model. And just to exacerbate the complexity one more level, you have movements in manufacturing going on based on the geopolitical position we find ourselves in, really starting with this idea of China for China and the movement of that manufacturing to places like Vietnam and the associated change management that goes with that. Also into Malaysia has also been a big recipient of the movement of manufacturing. The nearshoring efforts have really put Guadalajara in the forefront of North America's nearshoring issue. And also the emergence of India and what that means to the overall supply chain model as India continues to evolve to be more of an exporter than a consumer, which is a big change that is occurring in the supply chain. And the underpinning of all of this is the supply chain is more vital than it ever has been before. And each one of these manufacturing movements actually doubles the complexity of the supply chain every time another additional manufacturing site is created. So in response to this, the market has really, pushed for assurance of supply and resiliency. And ultimately, that is what's driving this 3 layers of complexity in the market. So what are we doing about it, right? The ecosystem, itself now is seeking innovative ways to address these supply chain challenges and really doing it in outside of the box, unique solutions, but a lot of times not having the capabilities in-house to deal with this increased complexity. And what this is doing now is turning supply chain, as I mentioned at the outset, as a vehicle now to capture, the capture and ensure that the innovation that is being put forward, the investments that are being put forward in research and design, ultimately it's supply chain that's going to return that investment in the form of revenue and meeting goals and the profitability expectations, along with customers' experience and satisfaction. So all of that now is being driven through the supply chain. So that's where the ecosystem itself is really turning to supply chain as a service as a mechanism to meet these goals. And that's really the underpinning of all of this. Now, on this slide, you see Mike Dominy, Vice President of Research at Gartner. He had put up a few examples of, just how supply chain as a service is manifesting itself. You've got one end of the spectrum where you've got Amazon. We all know them, but it really epitomizes a portion of supply chain as a service in terms of, them being this digital fulfillment engine via merchant of record models or seller of record models, ultimately giving companies the ability to engage their supply chain services to meet a gigantic market, a potential gigantic market demand. When you look at Siemens' part of it, they take a little bit different slant toward the services element and really focusing on product development in the form of engineering, lifecycle management, the tools in order to close designs and help with product development, and even in some cases, equipment as a service. And so where we really fit into that model is the tool that is the supply chain as a service, a tool in that OEM's toolbox to really, provide greater agility and resiliency in their supply chains that they either don't want to deploy the resources for, or maybe don't have the capabilities to engage it in the form of either tools or physical infrastructure, and ultimately turning to supply chain as a service as an avenue to solve those problems. We've been offering supply chain as a solution since 2010. We've developed this capability before it was a buzzword. I would say maybe we even helped come up with the buzzword at some time. But at that time, we saw this evolving supply chain gap that our customers and suppliers were experiencing, and really built a model around it. And so, as the last part of today's session, I want to share with you some of the success stories on how we're seeing, a couple in particular ecosystems really engaging supply chain as a service, as a tool in their toolbox to really solve some very complex challenges, but ultimately leading to revenue. And I think that's the key. It's not supply chain for supply chain's sake, but ultimately supply chain that is enabling very specific financials. So with that, I'll jump into, success story number one. Really comes from the highly competitive and cost-sensitive semiconductor space. So as you can see, in terms of the challenges, this customer was really seeking to reduce inventory, have greater supply flexibility, which generally you say, well, those two things are conflicting, but ultimately having ecosystem visibility with the underlying importance being control. They had no physical infrastructure available to them to move semiconductors or set up for semiconductors. And the second part of that challenge was really no tools that they could deploy that could bring their entire ecosystem together. And so ultimately, after a series of workshops with them defining what their problems were, we put forth a solution where we aggregated all of their buyers and both the demand side as well as the inventory into a single flow and a single location. That single flow and single location allowed them to really prioritize their manufacturing and optimize where that inventory was going per their priority, and not, sorry if you're hearing sirens in the background, and not the priority of their contract manufacturer. So it was really about control. And the overarching element of that is the digital enablement of a control tower. And again, I know this term is used a long time ago and has been resurrected, but it is an important part of all of these, as I'll close our discussion with. But ultimately, it's the control tower that pulls together the 14 demand streams, the inventory, and then the demand side from their own manufacturing, allowing them to make intelligent decisions. So the end result, and you can see some of the important benefits, but the end result is, in a time of product constraints, our customer utilized this supply chain as a service that filled the gap, allowing them the visibility they needed to enable informed and strategic decision making, and it truly resulted in them outperforming the market based on product availability in a constrained environment. And that's really what the quote says down in the lower right hand corner. It's a fantastic example of supply chain as a service, and one that we're really proud of. And at the time was the digital lift associated with this engagement to give them the visibility into the actionable insights to run their manufacturing was unprecedented in the market, not just within Avnet. So very, very good success story in a semiconductor environment. The next one I'll share with you really comes from networking infrastructure. Obviously another highly competitive market, and their challenge was a little bit different in that they had engaged in a industry leading application specific IC that they had designed in partnership with another semiconductor provider. And inside of that, they were seeking, to drive the technology edge, to drive the technology that they had created to market, in an agile manner, but also making sure they had a cost optimization element for their end customers. And when you look at what that means in this particular instance, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with high bandwidth memory, but this ASIC that they had designed with their semiconductor partner contained high bandwidth memory, which resulted in roughly 50% of the bill of materials, and that impacted their ability, negatively to compete in the market despite their technical advantage, based on the device cost, which was largely driven by margin stacking. And so what we were able to come in and propose at the time, a first of its kind model where we proposed to financially structure a model where we owned the high value components. It started with the high bandwidth memory, but we stepped in from a financial standpoint and implemented a supply chain as a service where we take ownership of the high ASP, high bandwidth memory, to avoid the margin stack of multiple stops in the semiconductor manufacturing train. And with that, we took 40% of the memory cost that was initially proposed out of the model. The secondary part of this, and again, I'll continue on this, the digital aspect of implementing a control tower allowed the OEM not just to see the finished good, but the digital overlay allows them to see, memory that's stored at the wafer fab, the work in process inventory at the wafer fab. The inventory then moves from the wafer fab to the test and assembly house, and they're able to see that inventory as well. And then that's capped off by the finished goods inventory. So at any time, they have the visibility to see their entire supply chain on this critical ASIC that became the cornerstone and ultimately led to this supply chain as a service that we put together for them, led to them making a huge stride in technology, but ultimately doing it at a cost and profitability point where they gained double-digit share against their competitors in the market. This, from a mixture of financial and supply chain standpoint, is one of the most complex things we've done. When you think about legal entities, when you think about title and the movement of goods, and then tying that all together digitally, it's really a great example of supply chain as a service in use, which is as I close out the two success stories, not what traditional distribution does in the open market. When you go back to the pyramid, these are for, these tailored and unique models are not in the middle of the pyramid, but rather, tailored and designed around a specific problem statement. So that's success story number two. And then lastly, I'll close, and you've heard me talk about this maybe even too much, but I just can't stress enough the criticality of embracing and engaging digital, in your supply chain models. I think that, there certainly is a lot of, opportunities to invest, and a lot of opportunities and tools to tie together. But ultimately, supply chain as a service is really there to help augment that and really create, an environment where, you can use the digital tools associated with the supply chain as a service to gain, the things you need. And as you see in the quote here from Heath Neunenmacher, with Tektronix, you might know them also as Milwaukee Tool and Ryobi. Tektronix is the parent company. As he notes, it's critical that digital ties all of this supply chain together and ultimately is the overlay of supply chain as a service, allowing these models to run. And in our experience, that speed and agility required to develop these solutions requires a dedicated supply chain enablement team. And that's what we've done at Avnet, and really looked at it from a position of having an agile, nimble team that sits next to our corporate IT and GIS, who often in these kind of models, when you need to move fast in a supply chain engagement, often move too slow. I'd say back in the day that was called bimodal supply chain, where you had a group that focused on big enterprise-wide things, and then you had a group that was doing agile, nimble, quick turn sprints to get models up and running in an agile, nimble way. And we've done that. And I encourage you, as you're looking, to fill gaps in your supply chain and looking towards supply chain as a service, to not overlook it. It is just so important to enabling your supply chain to make informed decisions, and get the information you need in order to really maximize revenue and profitability. And with that, I'll bring that to the session to a close. Uncharacteristically, I'm 2 minutes ahead of time, which is planned, by the way, but certainly maybe not a very common occurrence. So I'm very excited to field some questions, and I just want to say thank you for allowing us the time today. And Balaji, thanks to you and the team for all your support in getting this together for us. I'm going to stop sharing and turn my camera back on so that all y'all can see me, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you so much, David. The first battery of questions were the ones that you dodged at Electronica. So all the questions I had for you at Electronica, I'm going to be rolling them down out now. But you've also given me a very great platform to start with, which means you've talked extensively about Avnet Velocity, but you've also wrapped it around this whole subject of supply chain as a service. And so I guess my very first question is, when you talk about supply chain as a service, we in setting up this conference, we started out by trying to look at supply chain. Then we said, look, let's look at the product life cycle. So we renamed it Electronic Life Cycle and Supply Chain Summit.
Yes.
When does Avnet Velocity get involved? Is it on the entire, when in the life cycle do you get involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'm going to answer it in a couple different manners. I would say we, as a supply chain organization, like to get involved as early as possible in the process. And we have a methodology that starts with, much like building an ASIC, for those of you who are familiar with it, we really need to understand specifically what this supply chain needs to do. And it's before it's implemented, as the ideation of the product is going on, and then ultimately how that product is going to be built. We like to engage in that, develop problem statements. I think part of the magic in that is the problem statement, then becomes the rudder of where the program or where the opportunity is going. It's the workshop that follows that really, I think is the special sauce of it, where we get together and get around the table and really map it out together. Okay. Now I know that's adjacent to your question, but I'm getting there, because ultimately that's the foundation and the underpinning for the whole supply chain, right? The workshop, we invariably, that the output of that leads to a statement of work. But inside of that is the topic that you want addressed, which is, how if and I'll make it, generic. How is a supply chain organization who's going to manage, a large percentage of my bill of materials, how can it help me understand the product life cycle of those tools, or where, as an example, where there may be opportunities for second sourcing or high risk products or even EOL products before this supply chain is brought, all the way, to the production. And so those are the things that we're tying together now more than ever, because again, it's vitally critical that the BOM health and what that means to production, and also what that means to the costs that it takes to recover from that, whether that recovering is redesign, or whether that recovery is having to go to the independent market and inflate your BOM because you're having to spot buy on the market. All of those things now we've pulled into the design and the workshopping process to say, okay, what kind of security do you need out of this bill of material, right? What do we need to provide to make sure that, either the people that are building and buying on your behalf, are buying the right products at the right time, but, just overall BOM health risk or the BOM health risk analysis with that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, because you kind of yes, it does. So I'm going to take it a little, just to ask, does it, in one of the examples that you gave, you talked about a company developing an application specific IC, right? And that's a semiconductor company. So are there any differences in how you approach this, or how your customers and anyone else in the industry should approach these, whether it's an OEM, a contract manufacturer, or a semiconductor manufacturing company? Are there differences in how you use supply chain as a service?
I think that the implementation on how we use it is different, but our methodology is exactly the same. I mean, we have to understand on the front end very specifically what the job to be done is, what we're trying to accomplish, and then that bleeds through, into a supply chain. I would say, though, more often than not, and in both of those examples, it is a three-way partnership, and I intentionally use the word ecosystem a lot, because it isn't just.
Who are those partners?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Say again, Balaji.
Who are those partners? You mentioned three-way. In the example, it was just Avnet Velocity and the customer. Who's the third partner here?
Yeah. So, and we'll focus in on the ASIC example, because I think that's the best. The best example of the ecosystem coming together and truly creating something. So first and foremost, you have a memory provider who's providing die, which we are then, so that's partner number one. Memory is providing the die. We're holding that die at the fab company. Maybe it was the largest fab company in the world. So we have to set up with that fab company the supply chain that allows me to own that memory bought by the memory provider, to own that memory inside of their facility in a VMI location. I won't kill you with the manufacturing process, but there's a sub-assembly, and then that goes yet to another fab. So it's two different organizations inside the world's largest fab company. And then ultimately that semi-finished good goes to a final test and assembly house, who also has to be involved in the supply chain, and because the inventory then is held there. And so that's a totally different company, and in this case, in the same country. Then the supplier comes into play, the ASIC IP holder. So the OEM has, a concept and an idea and a design, but they partner with the semiconductor provider in order to get that design done, and then the manufacturing process starts. So that very same device moves from the final test and assembly house to the master distribution center of the semiconductor provider, and I still own the goods in the process throughout that whole thing. So when we're bringing an ecosystem together, I even lost count. There's at least 6 partners inside of that we're having to work with, in order to, attain the overall goal to make. It's not just the chip that needs to be cost effective. It's when they put 40 of them on a board, ultimately making this system more competitive in the market, right? And so that was the underlying goal.
You probably will not be expecting me to drop the word chiplets on you in this situation.
I'm so excited.
It just seems like that's the kind of perfect example in this current context of the electronics industry.
We are so excited. I personally am so excited about the evolution of chiplets, because that process I talked about took the OEM and the suppliers 18 months maybe to make that design work, right? And then you move into the manufacturing process. And with chiplets now coming, I mean, it's out there today. The common bus is being used in a lot of very rifle shot applications, but over time that will broaden, right? And what I see is exciting about that is taking this supply chain knowledge that we have in facilitating the supply chain of a semiconductor, and rather than it being linear, like I just talked about, the supply chain opportunity it's gonna also come in layers, and ultimately you're going to have the same problem statement with multiple semiconductor suppliers having goods in different shapes, or different forms through the manufacturing process, ultimately coming to a finished good. And you're going to have to financially optimize that, because if you don't, these parts will be too expensive for anybody to buy, making the finished good, not competitive in the market. So I think that the financial optimization the supply chain will bring in that layered approach with the multiple suppliers, I couldn't be more excited about it. We've got, I would say we have a few of these in the funnel right now, where we're tying together this concept of chiplets and building both a linear and a stacked supply chain model.
David, you'll be amazed how many people, including those who are actually involved in the business directly, don't really get the concept of the supply chain as a service. The first example you talked about the inventory management the inventory management service that you provided. And I penciled down the question and I said, is supply chain as a service limited to the management of the inventory and the velocity of the inventory? It seems to me that's not the case. That's just one part of what you do. Correct.
Yes. And I would say that what's evolved in particular over the last few years, as interest rates continue to go up. So you think of assurance of supply and resiliency, and those are math equations ultimately that lead to, some output that says I need to hold this amount of stuff in order to either recover from a disruption or if I have an opportunity or upside. But ultimately, it adds working capital into the model. And so what has occurred is during this time we're in right now, where historically we're not at all-time high interest rates, but we're at pretty high interest rates compared to where we were 4 years ago, where it wasn't even a factor. Banks are still lending back and forth to each other at over 5%. That becomes an important element of the supply chain, because you're not just optimizing supply chain anymore. You're not driving to assurance of supply and resiliency alone. You have to take into account the expense associated with it, because money's not free any longer. And so you're absolutely right. That ultimately becomes an important part of the supply chain models that we're designing today, because the cost of money is so high. So what we've done is really worked hard to provide avenues to tap into the best cost of capital in the market. So in the middle of that triangle, for 97% of the million customers I have, my cost of capital is just fine, right? But there are companies that maybe need a more aggressive cost of capital. And for that, then we've put together a stable of partners where we go and fund supply chain through a third party. And ultimately that rate is lower than my WACC, and then makes ultimately whatever that engagement is more successful. What we've found, especially in the last, I would say, year, is there are opportunities when we're at the top of the triangle. So those are kind of middle of the triangle, financial models. What we found in the last 6 months is an appetite as these larger companies are looking to gain control of their supply chain, in particular in the automotive space. Another avenue has emerged that we've designed around, which is the idea of all the people in the room, whether it's Avnet or the bank, sometimes the OEM's cash is the cheapest. And so how do we efficiently tap into the OEM's cash, their liquidity, and then use that to fund the supply chain? And so we've done that. So now as we're going through this problem statement, workshopping methodology, finance has to be a part of that. And invariably we're pulling finance from the OEMs and the EMS providers into those discussions to, work through the levers to say, well, how do we attain the best cost of capital if you need 60 days of inventory at all times, or 90 days, or 120 days. So we've really worked hard to build out a portfolio of options to really put on top of, physical, financial information, digital, and then finance. Those are the big four items.
That finance element actually plays it's obvious in the second example that you talked about, which is where Avnet actually took ownership of the memory, whether it's in raw materials or in process and all that stuff. When did you start doing this? I mean, I know that Avnet and other major distributors have always served as funders for the electronic supply chain. We don't like to talk about it.
No.
But the reality is that
I'm the only bank in the world with 3 million square feet of warehouse.
Exactly. I mean, you have the stock in the warehouse, but then you have this novel arrangement that you made where it's not even in your warehouse yet.
Yeah.
And it's also dedicated to a single supplier. I mean, how much relief that must have given them, knowing that the risk is being spread across so many different layers.
Well, just think of the margin stack associated with it, because like I say, this was a financial problem with a creative supply chain solution. And I think I can say this out loud, the semiconductor company who ultimately in the as was model, they had to buy the HBM memory, which was 50% of the bill of materials. And their company runs 60% margin. So in order for them to get the appropriate return, they have to take 50% of that bill of material, add 60% on top of it. Otherwise, the product ends up being dilutive to their financials. So this, when we got it all mapped out, was a double win, right? Because the ASP itself for the semiconductor company is at the profitability that they want. And then ultimately it results in a lower ASP for the OEM, which makes their finished good more competitive in the market. All based on the finance of the supply chain.
So this is the example you gave is about the semiconductor company. But we've also in the past in this industry seen situations where components as tiny as passives, capacitors as an example, can really kind of turn the entire supply chain or the manufacturing process into a mess. So you have the interconnect, passives, electromechanical companies also in the market. Are there scenarios where you've had to, or that you contemplate, supporting some of these suppliers in terms of the relationship that they have with their own customers, you as a major distributor and the other companies involved?
Yes. I would say scenario one, and I kind of glossed over the benefits and the stats, in scenario one, in a down year, we shipped into that model 30 billion devices. A majority of those, 90% to 95% of those, were caps and resistors. And you just think about, a gigantic semiconductor chip. And right now, there's anywhere from 1,100 to 1,800 passives that are, putting that multi-chip module together to create these monster compute chips. So yes, we joke around in the team a little bit that, supply chain for us is just stuff. It's really building the physical, financial, digital, and then ultimately the funding of it. But at the end of the day, it is just stuff. We've done some nutty things. We built a entire supply chain around acoustic powder one time for a cell phone manufacturer who had innovated around a speaker. And so we like to get out on the edge once in a while and do something that's never been done before. That was one. I don't want to get too crazy with it, but at one point a partner was in need during the pandemic, and we owned 42,000 tons of titanium moly bar. I won't explain why, but sometimes we'll get out on the edge and do something. And brings value to the market. It's just stuff to us in a lot of cases. So,
David, this has been wonderful. My last question, I go back to one of the things that I realized about Avnet Velocity years ago. It's about having an excellent digital platform to work from and making sure that this is seamlessly linked to your customers. How have things changed in recent years? Are you having to reinforce that more, that digital link with the customers, or do you have a variant that's developed since?
Yeah, it's become a cornerstone of our business. I'd say 5 years ago, we didn't have a digital team. We had supply chain solutions architects on staff, and we do a lot of work with ASU, and we brought a young lady in who had both a computer science and supply chain background. And we had one of these aha moments where she looked at something we were doing and kind of flipped it on its head and said, why don't you do it this way? 5 years later, we have 15 of those on the team. I mean, that's just how important it is. And as I mentioned during the section, I think everybody needs to be careful to get those too caught up in the corporate, mapping and planning, and really work hard to keep them separate and have them be agile and nimble and being able to do quick turn things specific for customers. Where they're not in there tinkering around with SAP code. That's not what I'm saying, but having that autonomy to be agile and nimble, it has made all the difference, because ultimately out of the supply chain, you want assurance of supply and control. And if you can't see it, you can't control it. You can't create actionable insights if there's no visibility to the supply chain and something triggering me to say, hey, you have a problem or you have an opportunity. And that team, to me, it all revolves around the people. And then we put the process I laid out for you earlier along with the people, and that's where some of that digital magic occurs, or that is where the digital magic occurs. It's really around the team we have and their focus.
I like the way you kind of ended this. I like the fact that you said, if you can't see it, you can't control it. I wrote that down, and then you talked it. That's where the magic occurs. Honestly, David, people don't get it, but it's in the supply chain. It's in the lifecycle management that the magic occurs. When you get that product, it lands on your desk, it's in your hand, you're using it. You really, really don't understand the magic that took it there. Thank you for helping us to understand this, David. It's really been a pleasure. I hope we get the chance to talk at some other time about the examples that you've just given us. I'm sure there is a lot more. So we're going to be coming back to ask you to share some more of this. Thank you.
Anytime. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and everybody attending. It's exciting to get an opportunity to talk about it out loud in a venue like this. So I really appreciate the time, and anytime I'm available. So take care, and
thank you
so much.